All right, we are in the process of reading through the Gospel of Mark. At least most of it we're going to hit on Sunday mornings. But if you weren't here, let me give you a little bit of recap where we've been in the story. Jesus has appeared with a radical message, sort of a new way for people to experience God. And he calls it the kingdom of God. And it's not talking about it as a destination that we strive to get to someday by following the rules. He says, no, this is about God coming to us, challenging what we thought we knew about God to live in a new way. And he shows then, by his actions, by his words, what this kingdom of God looks like. And it's done primarily by restoring broken and unclean people. That's who Jesus was. He spends his time. That's what he does. People suffering from illness or demon possession or leprosy are made whole. They're brought back into community. And he sends his disciples out. He says, you do the same thing. That's what this is about, drawing people in. Now, he attracts a lot of attention by this. But as he does this, he's not pointing to himself. He's always pointing to what God is doing, not pointing to himself. He says, these are just... what I'm doing are simply signs of what God desires for us as his people. It's not really setting up a new religion, but he does sort of challenge the people who are set in very particular religious traditions. And that doesn't go well with those who are in charge. But he invites people to look with fresh eyes. And so one of the ways he does that is to tell parables. And we looked at some of those last week. Again, remember, parables are not illustrations intended to make things more clear. It says they're stories that have an edge. They create some cognitive dissonance. They say, wait a second, that's not quite right. And then we have to think about what's not quite right about that and try to think, what does this mean? It gauges our imagination to say there's a new way of thinking. And we looked at some of those last week. Stories that frame the kingdom of God as something that is organic, something that is living, something that's growing. It's a process, not something that's stationary, right? Not a systematic religion that has rules, but a way of living. If you remember last week, Jesus was teaching from a boat. The crowds were so great that they were pressing in. And so to get some space, some distance, he got on a boat and would push off a little bit from shore. The people would line the shore, and he would then teach and preach from the boat. When he was done preaching then, it says they were already in the boat. He says, well, we're already in a boat. Let's go to the other side. Let's cross the Sea of Galilee. Now, we call it the Sea of Galilee. It's really a lake, right? It's not that huge lake. It's only about 8 miles across. But it's a nice-sized lake, and really unique lake in the world. It's the lowest freshwater lake in the world, right? 700 feet below sea level is where this lake is. So you're not going to find another lake, freshwater lake, anywhere in the world that low. It's at the bottom of what we call the Rift Valley. It's just one of these most fascinating geological features. It stretches almost 4,000 miles from the Ka Valley up in Syria comes and the Sea of Galilee, and all at the bottom end of it is Lake Malawi. All right, it's this huge trench where these two tectonic plates have come together or are separating, where they're joining there. Anyway, that's got nothing to do with the sermon this morning, but I just love Lake Galilee. Anyway, so they decide 8 miles across. Let's go ahead. Let's cross the lake. You could walk around the lake. They could get to the other side. It's only about 15 miles if they wanted to walk around. But let's sail across. And so they go across. And it's a different world. Only 8 miles away, but it's a completely different world. It's no longer Jewish country. It's a country of the Gentiles. It's a place they consider to be a land of outsiders. So why would they go there? We don't know. Maybe Jesus says, boy, I need a break from these crowds. No one's going to be cheering me or looking for me there because we're outside the Jewish community. And so they go and they cross the other side. Maybe Maybe Jesus figured outsiders need good news as well. We're not told why, but they do cross. And so that's where we want to pick up our reading today. All right, they came across the other side to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs. No one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart. The shackles he broke into pieces. No one had strength to subdue him. And night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was howling and bruising himself with stones. All right, I didn't see that coming, all right? All right, here he's been preaching to people. Now all of a sudden, absolute crazy man. And he's unclean, to the max. It's an unclean land. Here's a man possessed with unclean spirits living in a cemetery tainted by the uncleanness of death. You don't get any more unclean. This is ultimate unclean that you can be. And again, the language here, that of being possessed by unclean spirits. And this is something strange for us. As it's for most of us, it's outside of our experience of demon possession, at least in our regular life. And whenever we wrestle with something like this, we have to say, well, what is this going on? Is this literally a possession of evil spirits? Is it what today we would call a mental illness? I don't know. Again, remember back then, there was not a distinction back then between illness and the forces of evil. They were the same. There was not a distinction made between the two. And so Jesus could say, be healed, or he could say, your sins are forgiven. He says, it's the same thing. Whatever it is, it was a condition for this man that created isolation for him. He was by himself. The community could not handle him with them. And so he was forced out to live where no one else lived, which often happens. We push away things that we fear so we don't have to face them. Anyway, back to our... When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran, he bowed down before him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." As if Jesus would torment anyone. But this conflict, forces of good, forces of evil. For Jesus had said to him, the text goes on, "Come out of him, you unclean spirit." Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Again, if you remember, Legion it's a military term for a deployment of about 6,000 troops. So this guy had a lot of issues going on. The man begged Jesus not to send him out of the country. Now in the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." And so he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out, they entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. This story just gets weirder and weirder as you go along. Not sure what to make of that, other than it's an unclean land, and swine was the most unclean animal they could think of. All right, so unclean land, unclean man, unclean where he's living, and they go into unclean animals, fitting host for unclean spirits. But it's easy to get distracted here. It's not a story about swine. All right, there's simply a symbol of uncleanness. It doesn't seem fair to the swine, but that's a distraction. It's about this man. But the actions do not go unnoticed, right? The swineherds ran off and they told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what had happened. They came to Jesus. They saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed, in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Again, fear here is at least a healthy respect, maybe a better translation than fear, is appropriate response, right? If you're encountering something powerful beyond our imagination, fear is maybe not a bad response. It's sort of like the awe of the disciples. One of the passages we skipped was on the trip over from the 8-mile trip from one side of the lake to the other. The disciples end up in this big storm, right? And Jesus stills the storm as they're crossing the lake. And the disciples, they say again, they're in awe. They are in fear. I say, who is this who has power even to control the wind and the waves? And so they know that they are in the presence of something big. Now those who had seen what happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it, and they begged Jesus to leave their neighborhood. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged Jesus that he might be with him. But Jesus refused. He said, "Go to your friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown to you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. All right, so that first. At first, I didn't get it. I said, well, come on, Jesus. Why not let the poor guy come with you? All right, he's been through a lot. But Jesus said, no, the point of my healing is not about you following me. It's about restoring you to your community. And he says, go to your people. Tell them what God has done, what God can do. With stories like these, sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the strangeness of the story, as opposed to trying to say, what can we see that is similar to us, or finding ourselves in the story. But that's what I really invite us to do as we read the Gospel of Mark. Not just to say a story about somewhere long ago and far away, but something, how is this like our lives? Now, most of us are not suffering from this kind of violence or self-harm or lack of control that seem to be in this man's life. But we do know something. Most of us have had an experience of knowing something about isolation. And that's one thing the man did experience, the result of his condition, that he felt excluded by others. And most of us at one time or another know that experience of being excluded, whether it was in the lunchroom at school or a social media snub, or maybe it's when we moved to a new community, or maybe we were treated differently after a change in marital status, or after we got a diagnosis or started treatment, and things just were not like they were before. So in some way or another, many of us have that kind of experience of isolation, and we know that reality. It's often easier to heal a broken bone than it is to heal a broken relationship. But both, in this case, we're very much needed in the kind of healing in our lives. This kingdom of God that Jesus keeps talking about, keeps illustrating with his words and with his actions, was about bringing people together, right? Restoring of our broken humanity. To break down the walls that we have erected to separate us, that keep us from recognizing our common humanity. I mean, it's so easy to divide ourselves by race or by religion or orientation or by our politics. It's so easy to give in to fear for those who are different than us. And we might feel powerless to change. We say, well, that's just the way the world is. But this text tells us we are not powerless. And the power of the one who can still the waves and the storm, the one who can turn someone's life completely around. It says, I am with you, and my power is your power. That's what these miracles that we're going to see here in the Gospel of Mark are all about. Glimpses of the kingdom, the power of God at work in and through us, this power to heal brokenness that we experience. This is what we call good news. This is what we call the gospel. And we'll hear some more next week, so be sure you come back to see where we're going. If you want to read ahead into Matthew 6 as we go there. Let's get Joan back up here. This is a Sunday for old favorite hymns. So what a friend we have in Jesus.